Many people sense that something is wrong with their finances, even when headlines say inflation is easing or economies are stabilizing. Salaries arrive on time, employment numbers look healthy, and growth continues. Yet everyday life feels tighter, more constrained, and less secure. This feeling is not imaginary, and it is not simply the result of temporary price spikes. It reflects a deeper and quieter process, the long-term erosion of purchasing power. Purchasing power determines what your income can actually buy, and when it declines, living standards fall even if nominal wages rise. What makes this process so unsettling is that it rarely happens through sudden collapse. Instead, it unfolds gradually through small price increases, slower wage growth, higher essential costs, and subtle shifts in how money functions within the economy. Over time, these changes compound, leaving people feeling poor without a clear moment when things broke. To understand why this is happening, and why it persists even when inflation appears under control, we need to look beyond prices and examine the structural forces that quietly reshape purchasing power across modern economies. Purchasing power erodes when income growth fails to keep pace with the true cost of living, and this gap has been widening for decades. While official inflation measures track average price changes, they often understate the pressures people feel in essentials such as housing, healthcare, education, energy, and food, which consume a growing share of household budgets. At the same time, wage growth has become increasingly disconnected from productivity gains, meaning workers produce more value without receiving proportional compensation. This disconnect causes incomes to rise slowly while core expenses accelerate, shrinking what money can actually buy. The process feels silent because it does not involve dramatic pay cuts or sudden shortages, but rather a steady recalibration of expectations as households adjust to smaller margins and reduced flexibility. Savings lose effectiveness as buffers, long-term plans become harder to maintain, and financial stress becomes normalized. Governments may point to stable averages or improving indicators, but purchasing power is experienced individually, not statistically. Over long periods, even modest annual gaps between wages and essential costs compound into meaningful declines in living standards. What makes this erosion especially difficult to confront is that it rarely triggers immediate crisis, allowing the system to continue functioning while quietly transferring pressure onto households. The result is a widespread sense that effort no longer delivers security, not because people are failing, but because the economic framework has shifted in ways that systematically weaken purchasing power over time. If purchasing power is collapsing without dramatic inflation, the next question is, what structural forces are driving this slow and persistent decline? One of the most powerful structural forces driving the silent collapse of purchasing power is the way modern economies have redefined growth and stability around asset prices rather than real incomes. Over recent decades, economic policy has increasingly focused on supporting financial markets, housing values, and credit expansion as indicators of success, even when these measures fail to improve everyday affordability. When asset prices rise faster than wages, the cost of entry into basic economic security increases, forcing households to spend a larger share of income just to maintain the same standard of living. Housing is the clearest example, as rising property values boost wealth on paper while simultaneously increasing rents, mortgages, and barriers to ownership, directly reducing purchasing power for non-owners. This dynamic extends beyond housing into healthcare, education, and other services tied to asset-heavy systems where prices reflect capital costs rather than household incomes. Governments often tolerate or even encourage this imbalance because asset appreciation supports consumption, tax revenues, and financial stability, masking underlying weakness in real income growth. As a result, policies that stabilize markets can unintentionally weaken purchasing power by inflating costs faster than wages adjust. Over time, households adapt by taking on more debt, reducing savings, or lowering expectations, which temporarily sustains consumption but deepens vulnerability. This adaptation creates the illusion that the system is functioning even as living standards quietly erode. Purchasing power does not collapse through one shock, but through repeated cycles where asset protection is prioritized over income growth, gradually shifting economic pressure onto those least able to absorb it. If asset-focused stability weakens purchasing power, the next issue is how debt is used to conceal this erosion rather than solve it. Debt plays a central role in masking the decline of purchasing power by allowing households to maintain consumption even as real incomes fall behind rising costs. When wages fail to keep pace with essentials, borrowing becomes the bridge between what people earn and what life demands, transforming debt from a temporary tool into a permanent coping mechanism. Credit cards, longer mortgages, student loans, and buy now pay later schemes expand purchasing capacity in the short term, creating the impression that living standards are stable, but this stability is borrowed from the future. Each increase in household leverage reduces flexibility, as a larger share of income is committed to servicing past expenses rather than improving present well-being. This dynamic quietly shifts risk from the system onto individuals, because debt obligations remain fixed even when incomes fluctuate. At the macro level, debt-fueled consumption supports economic growth figures and corporate revenues, reinforcing policies that favor credit expansion over wage growth. Financial institutions benefit from interest payments and fees, while governments avoid confronting the political difficulty of addressing cost structures directly. Over time, this arrangement normalizes fragility as households become more sensitive to shocks such as rate increases, job loss, or unexpected expenses. What makes debt an effective concealment mechanism is that it delays visible crisis, allowing the erosion of purchasing power to continue without triggering immediate adjustment. The cost is cumulative as future income is increasingly pre-allocated, leaving less room for resilience or upward mobility. When debt replaces income growth as the stabilizer of daily life, purchasing power may appear intact on the surface, but it is being hollowed out beneath, setting the stage for broader vulnerability when conditions tighten. If debt hides the decline of purchasing power today, the next question is what happens when borrowing can no longer expand fast enough to keep up? When borrowing can no longer expand fast enough to offset rising costs, the erosion of purchasing power becomes more visible and more painful because the limits of debt force households to confront underlying imbalances. Interest rate increases, tighter credit standards, or slower income growth quickly expose how dependent daily life has become on borrowing. Monthly payments rise, refinancing options disappear, and budgets that once felt manageable begin to strain, even without dramatic changes in employment or headline inflation. This shift reveals a key vulnerability in modern economies. Purchasing power has been propped up not by sustainable income growth, but by access to credit conditioned on favorable financial environments. As rates rise or credit tightens, consumption slows, not because needs decline, but because financing them becomes harder. Businesses respond by cutting costs or raising prices, governments face pressure to intervene, and central banks are forced to balance inflation control against financial stress. These responses often prioritize system stability over restoring real purchasing power, reinforcing the cycle. The burden falls disproportionately on those with less savings, fewer assets, and more exposure to variable costs, deepening inequality and insecurity. What makes this phase particularly destabilizing is that it feels abrupt to households, even though it is the result of long-term trends. Years of gradual erosion are suddenly felt at once when debt stops expanding, transforming quiet decline into overt stress. Purchasing power does not collapse because prices spike overnight, but because the mechanisms that once concealed its decline stop working. When debt can no longer absorb the pressure, the next question is how inflation and monetary policy interact to shape who bears the cost of adjustment. Inflation and monetary policy determine how the cost of adjustment is distributed once debt can no longer shield households from rising expenses, and this distribution is rarely neutral. When inflation persists, it reduces the real value of existing debt, benefiting borrowers and governments, but it simultaneously erodes the purchasing power of wages and savings, shifting the burden toward workers and retirees. Central banks attempt to manage this trade-off by tightening policy to slow price growth. Yet higher interest rates increase debt servicing costs and weaken labor markets, placing additional strain on incomes. If policy tightens too quickly, unemployment and financial stress rise. If it tightens too slowly, inflation continues to chip away at purchasing power. This balancing act means that adjustment is often spread unevenly over time and across groups, rather than resolved decisively. Asset owners may be protected as policymakers seek to avoid market instability, while renters and wage earners absorb higher costs with limited relief. Governments may deploy targeted subsidies or transfers, but these measures often lag price dynamics and can inadvertently reinforce inflation by supporting demand without addressing supply constraints. Over time, households internalize this uncertainty, adjusting expectations downward and accepting reduced purchasing power as the new normal. What makes this interaction especially damaging is that it blurs accountability, allowing inflation to function as an implicit policy choice without explicit debate about who should bear the costs. As monetary policy oscillates between restraint and support, purchasing power continues to erode incrementally, even when inflation rates appear to stabilize. The outcome is not a clear reset, but a drawn-out adjustment in which living standards decline quietly while the system avoids overt crisis. If inflation and policies spread adjustment unevenly, the next issue is how this process reshapes behavior, trust, and long-term economic decisions across society. As purchasing power continues to erode through uneven adjustment, the most lasting impact emerges in how people change their behavior and expectations in response. When households no longer trust that income growth will preserve living standards, they shift priorities away from long-term planning toward short-term survival and protection. Saving in cash feels ineffective, so people chase assets not out of optimism, but out of necessity, seeking shelter from rising costs rather than opportunity for advancement. Consumption patterns change as well, with discretionary spending shrinking while essentials dominate budgets, reducing quality of life even when employment remains stable. Workers become more risk-averse, delaying career moves, entrepreneurship, or further education because the margin for error narrows. Businesses respond by focusing on pricing strategies, cost control, and financial engineering rather than long-term investment, as demand becomes more fragile and unpredictable. These adaptations may be rational individually, but collectively they reduce economic dynamism and resilience. Trust also erodes as official indicators diverge from lived experience, making institutions appear disconnected or ineffective. When people hear that inflation is under control while their expenses continue to rise faster than income, confidence in policy credibility weakens. Over time, this gap fosters disengagement, cynicism, and polarization, as economic outcomes feel increasingly detached from effort or merit. The silent collapse of purchasing power thus reshapes not only balance sheets but mindsets, lowering expectations, and redefining what feels normal. This psychological adjustment allows the system to persist without dramatic collapse, but at the cost of ambition, mobility, and social cohesion. What appears as stability on the surface masks a deeper stagnation driven by constrained choices and diminished trust. When behavior and expectations adapt downward, the next question is how this quiet shift alters social structure and generational outcomes over time. As expectations adjust downward across society, the silent collapse of purchasing power begins to reshape social structure and generational outcomes in ways that are difficult to reverse. Younger generations enter adulthood facing higher costs, heavier debt burdens, and fewer opportunities to accumulate assets, while older cohorts who acquired housing or investments earlier are better insulated from rising prices. This generational divide is not primarily cultural but economic, rooted in timing and exposure to asset inflation versus wage stagnation. As purchasing power weakens, milestones that once defined progress, such as home ownership, family formation, or entrepreneurship, are delayed or abandoned, altering life trajectories and social norms. Intergenerational transfers become more important, reinforcing inequality based on family wealth rather than individual effort. At the same time, geographic mobility declines as people remain locked into locations they can afford rather than moving toward opportunity. These constraints reduce labor market flexibility and dampen long-term growth potential. Governments may attempt to address generational imbalance through targeted programs or rhetoric, but without restoring purchasing power, such efforts struggle to gain traction. Over time, social cohesion weakens as shared assumptions about progress erode and experiences diverge across age and income groups. The system continues to function, but it does so with growing internal tension, as fewer people believe that participation alone will lead to security or advancement. Purchasing power thus acts as a foundation for social mobility, and when it collapses quietly, inequality becomes entrenched across generations rather than corrected over time. If generational outcomes are being reshaped by declining purchasing power, the next issue is how this trend feeds back into politics, policy, and long-term stability. As declining purchasing power reshapes generational outcomes, it increasingly feeds back into politics and policy, altering how societies respond to economic pressure. When large segments of the population feel that progress is slipping out of reach, political priorities shift from long-term growth toward immediate relief and protection. Voters become more sensitive to cost of living issues, skeptical of abstract economic success, and less patient with gradual reforms that promise benefits far in the future. This environment rewards policies that manage symptoms rather than address structural causes, such as temporary subsidies, price controls, or short-term tax relief, which can ease pressure briefly but often fail to restore real purchasing power. At the same time, governments remain constrained by high debt levels and asset-dependent financial systems, limiting their ability to pursue reforms that might reduce prices or rebalance income distribution without triggering instability. As a result, policy becomes reactive, focused on maintaining social calm rather than rebuilding the foundations of affordability. Political discourse grows more polarized as different groups experience the economies in fundamentally different ways, making consensus harder to achieve. Institutions tasked with managing the economy face declining trust, as their tools appear less effective at improving everyday life. Over time, this feedback loop reduces policy credibility and narrows the range of viable options, reinforcing the sense that the system is stuck. Purchasing power continues to erode, not because solutions are unknown, but because the political and economic constraints created by years of quiet decline make decisive action increasingly difficult. When politics becomes reactive and constrained, the final question is whether the system can still correct course, or whether deeper adjustment is inevitable. When political systems become reactive and constrained, the capacity to correct declining purchasing power through gradual reform weakens, increasing the likelihood that adjustment arrives through pressure rather than planning. As costs continue to rise faster than incomes, households exhaust coping mechanisms such as debt, savings drawdowns, or reduced consumption, leaving fewer buffers to absorb shocks. Economic stress that was once diffuse becomes more concentrated and visible, forcing institutions to respond under less favorable conditions. At this stage, policy choices narrow further, because restoring purchasing power would require measures that challenge entrenched interests, reduce asset values, or accept slower nominal growth, all of which carry short-term pain. Instead, systems often drift toward prolonged stagnation, where inflation moderates but living standards fail to recover, locking in losses rather than reversing them. This outcome preserves surface stability while allowing dissatisfaction to deepen, making economies more vulnerable to external shocks or internal disruption. History shows that periods of declining purchasing power rarely resolve themselves without structural change, whether through policy realignment, financial restructuring, or shifts in the balance between labor and capital. The danger of silent erosion is that it delays these adjustments until they become unavoidable and more disruptive. Purchasing power does not collapse in a single moment. It weakens until resilience is gone, and when stress finally breaks through, responses are rushed rather than deliberate. The longer correction is postponed, the greater the social and economic cost when it arrives, because expectations, institutions, and behaviors have adapted to a lower baseline of security. With resilience fading and options narrowing, the final question is how societies ultimately respond when purchasing power can no longer be quietly managed. When purchasing power can no longer be quietly managed, societies are forced into a period of visible adjustment that tests economic structures, political legitimacy, and social cohesion. At this stage, the gap between incomes and essential costs becomes too large to absorb through debt, expectation management, or temporary relief, pushing the issue into the center of public debate. Governments face hard choices between protecting asset values, restoring affordability, or redefining growth expectations, knowing that each path carries trade-offs that inflation once softened. Some economies respond through structural reforms that rebalance wages, productivity, and costs, while others drift into prolonged stagnation or experience sharper corrections that reset prices and expectations abruptly. History suggests that systems built on eroding purchasing power eventually change, not because collapse is inevitable, but because social tolerance reaches its limit. The danger of the silent collapse is not sudden breakdown, but the cumulative loss of resilience that leaves societies less prepared for shocks and less capable of coordinated response. Understanding purchasing power as a foundation of stability rather than a side effect of inflation helps explain why restoring it requires more than technical policy fixes. It demands confronting the deeper forces that weakened it, including asset-driven growth, debt dependence, and uneven exposure to rising costs. Whether adjustment happens gradually through deliberate reform or abruptly through crisis depends on how long societies continue to postpone these choices. If you want to understand how purchasing power, inflation, debt, and policy quietly shape everyday life, follow this series and watch the next videos where we break down the systems behind today, our economic pressures, and what they mean for your future.